Buenos días, bienvenidas y bienvenidos todos a esta sesión del seminario de Permanente Internacional, Espacio, Cultura y Turismo. El día de hoy nos acompaña la doctora Christine Van Winkel. Ella es investigadora en la Universidad de Manitoba, en la parte de kinesiología, y me voy a permitir leer su semblanza. El día de hoy nos va a hablar sobre un tema muy interesante, que es un tema sobre festivales y cuestiones de riesgo. Entonces, permítanme un segundo mientras abro su semblanza. Mm, Ok. Ok. Voy a también mencionarlo en inglés. Denme un segundito que no encuentro la semblanza. Ok. Lo siento. Christine Van Winkel es una investigadora que está comprometida con la investigación basada en comunidades. Ella explora el poder transformativo de los festivales y sus atracciones. Actualmente trabaja como profesora investigadora en la Universidad de Manitoba en Canadá y también trabaja como asociada en la Universidad Royal Roads, igual en Canadá. Como una creadora y coordinadora de festivales y eventos, ella puede brindar tanto la experiencia práctica como la experiencia basada en teoría para realizar sus investigaciones. A través de sus investigaciones, Christine ha trabajado con más de 30 diferentes festivales y atracciones a nivel nacional e internacional. Su investigación explora las experiencias de festivales, la gestión de emergencias en eventos, el rol de festivales y eventos y su recuperación en situaciones de crisis. Cristina ha publicado en diferentes journals, en diferentes revistas, con temáticas variadas sobre turismo, sobre ocio, sobre eventos y, bueno, ha participado también en conferencias y en en la realización de diferentes reportes. Actualmente también ella es editora asociada del Journal Event Management, de Leisure Lusoir y de International Journal of Event and Festival Management. Sirve también como parte del consejo editorial del Journal of Hospitality and Tourist Research. Y bueno, el día de hoy nos va a hablar sobre la Revelry and Recovery de festivales, como la importancia de los festivales. La conferencia va a ser en inglés. Les invitamos a que pongan sus comentarios y sus preguntas en español. Sin ningún problema se las diremos a nuestra ponente del día de hoy y las traduciremos. Entonces, welcome, Christine. Phones and cameras are with you. Microphones and cameras are with you.
Excellent. Gracias. Thank you so much for having me. Buenos dias, everybody. I desperately wish my Spanish was much better and I could actually deliver a presentation in Spanish. Sadly, my last Spanish was in high school, which was a very long time ago. But it is definitely a bucket list goal of mine is to at some point enhance my Spanish language skills. But for today, I'm going to present research I've been doing in English. And so if you just bear with me one moment, I'm going to launch my presentation and we'll get started. Okay, if somebody could just confirm for me that you see the screen that says Revelry and Recovery.
Sí, sí se ve.
Excellent. And I've left the captioning up in English just in case that's helpful to anyone, because I know I can sometimes start to speak a little bit quickly. So I'm going to talk today about Revelry and Recovery, festivals and community resilience. And my intention for today is to share with you the journey I've been on in terms of exploring this particular topic. So I'm going to begin by sharing with you some past research that helped inform the research I'd like to talk about today. As Giselda mentioned, I'm coming to you from the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is on Treaty 1 territory, which is the homelands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. Also, in the community I live in the city I live in, our water originates from Shoal Lake, and so we are forever grateful to the peoples of those lands for that. The research I'm going to talk about today has mostly been funded through the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And so I am forever grateful to their ongoing support for the research that I'm doing. I also want to thank all the various collaborators in the projects I've worked on. I'm going to talk about a number of different projects, and there have been students, postdocs, as well as researchers at other institutions who have contributed endless hours, brilliant ideas to this work. And I'll try to acknowledge them as we move through the presentation today. But in particular, I want to acknowledge Jean Slick, who's at Royal Roads University, which Giselda mentioned is an institution in Western Canada in the province of British Columbia, where I have adjunct status. And Jean provides really important context in terms of emergency and disaster management to the work I do around festivals and events and community. And so I appreciate Jean's meaningful contribution to all of the work that I'm going to talk about today. So here at the University of Manitoba, I'm in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management, which sometimes catches people by surprise. I teach predominantly in the Recreation Management program, where I teach event management and tourism management. And my background is in parks, recreation, and tourism management. With an undergraduate degree that I started in anthropology and geography, and then transitioned into recreation and tourism, and then completed a master's and PhD. But here at the University of Manitoba, my focus is mostly on event management. And so for the last 16 years, since I've been at the University of Manitoba, I've really focused all of my research on festival and event experiences. Today's presentation is going to, as I mentioned, talk about both past research as well as some current research that is underway. And I'm going to start by sharing an introduction to the general area. Then I want to talk about some definitions and conceptual frameworks, just so that we're all speaking around the same ideas and concepts and framing them in similar ways as I move through the presentation. Then I'm going to share with you what I think are some really interesting case studies. And then I'm going to frame all of that within something called the service ecosystem perspective, which is a theoretical framework that originated in economics and marketing, and that I believe is a really useful tool to understanding the roles of festivals and events within communities. And then I'm going to share some concluding thoughts, and we'll have an opportunity for questions. And I look forward to any discussion or ideas that you all want to share with me. So I mentioned earlier that most of my work revolves around understanding festivals, and the work I've done has started by focusing on festival experiences and what those experiences mean to individuals. And that's partially because of the background I have in leisure and recreation management. And what's interesting to me about festivals and events is that they're often highlighted as valuable tourism attractions, as well as community development initiatives, because of the money they bring into a community. So festivals are known to contribute about $1 trillion to the world's economies. And here in Canada, our local industry association estimates that our largest festivals contribute about $1 billion to the economy. And this doesn't include all the small little community events and festivals. This is just reflecting some of our largest, most well-known festivals. What I find interesting about this is that often it's the economic impact of festivals that is highlighted to showcase their value, but it's typically the social value of these events that matter within the community, and that is why communities tend to produce and engage in events. So before I go any further, it's probably a good idea to make sure to define the concept that we're going to talk about today. So festivals. When I talk about festivals, I'm really referring to those publicly accessible themed celebrations. So by public, I don't necessarily mean free. I just mean that anybody from the public can choose to purchase admission or attend for free. And that usually there's some sort of theme and there's a celebratory feeling around the event. So when I'm talking about festivals, I'm including both large, small scale, as well as music, theater, food, recreation, dance. It could be historic themed. Whatever the theme is doesn't matter so much. More importantly is the fact that they're publicly accessible themed celebrations. Typically, festivals are launched within a community to serve two purposes. One, to provide recreation opportunities for visitors or for residents, as well as provide tourism opportunity to guests. Now, festivals are highly valued because they're very flexible. They're often seen as cost-effective ways of delivering recreation opportunities for residents, but also an effective way of developing attractions for visitors that are less costly than, say, permanent built attractions. By producing arts and culture, festivals are often able to serve many, many goals, and I've heard them referred to in the literature as a Swiss Army knife. So a diverse tool that can reach and serve many goals simultaneously. And they've often been shown to contribute to many community benefits, including things like sense of place, sense of community, economic development, and community development. And I'll share a couple of specific studies around that in a moment. When I explore festivals as a concept, typically I'm looking at it through the lens of tourism, recreation, and events management. Festivals have been studied for a very long time through fields like anthropology, geography, management, and all of these different fields of practice take a slightly different lens when they look at the concept of festivals. And so it's important to me that you see where I'm coming at this from, where I'm really looking at the experience that's produced in order to enhance tourism, recreation, and event experiences within a community. We know that festival experiences are multidimensional, that they include personal, social, cultural, physical, place, and spiritual elements. An important concept in the festival literature comes from anthropology and talks about this idea of communitas, or this shared communal experience that's had at festivals. So communitas comes to us out of anthropology, but we see that the festival and event literature has really expanded on this idea to look at the various community outcomes of events. And two of the most common phenomenons that are examined with regards to the communal aspect of events and festivals are the idea of sense of community and sense of place. And I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about sense of community. Another important concept to understand about festivals is this idea of liminality. Liminality also comes to us from anthropology and is this idea of a unique time and space outside of our everyday experience that allows us to have it's sometimes described as an out-of-body experience. And so festivals, by being time limited, often in a space that's used in an alternative way, gives us an opportunity to have that kind of experience. It's also important to acknowledge that while there are many benefits to festivals for both attendees and communities, and I've highlighted some of them already today, it's important to acknowledge that there are social, environmental, and economic impacts from festivals within communities. And the literature in this area is well established and continues to grow. And so we know that there are both benefits and drawbacks socially to hosting events and festivals. There are many detrimental impacts in terms of the local environment, but there are also some benefits that have been shown. And the area that explores the sustainable festival and event management is definitely a growing body of work. And then, of course, there's the economic impacts, which have been fairly well studied within the festival literature. So now that we have a kind of common starting point in terms of exploring the concept of festivals, I wanted to talk about 5 different studies that have culminated in informing the work that I'm doing with others on Revelry and recovery. And so before I launch into the work we're doing now, I want to highlight how the past research in different areas of festival and event management has really built to this culmination of wanting to explore festivals in the context of communities that have experienced a disaster. So I'm going to talk about 5 different studies very briefly. One looks at festivals and community outcomes, and this was work done with Kyle Woosnam, who's well known for his work around festival social impacts. And so Kyle and I, as well as some students, did work together looking at sense of community and perception of festival social impacts. Then Drizelda and I actually had the pleasure of working together, looking at festival cancellations and how festival cancellation messages are communicated, as well as how they're understood by those who receive those messages. I'm also going to talk about a study that looked at service dominant logic in the festival experience that I worked with a PhD student, Jill Budefeld, here at the University of Manitoba, where we looked at different dimensions of the festival experience. And then we undertook research during the pandemic. We were unfortunate that the pandemic began or was kind of recognized, and the impact of it was taking place right as we had received funding to look at emergency management at festivals. And so we were able to transition that work to look specifically at festivals during the pandemic. And so a student here at the University of Manitoba, Sasha Coleman, and I looked at how the business model of festivals was changing during the pandemic. And then finally, there's some research that I did with a practitioner, Sean Corrigan, who at the time worked at Calian Emergency Management, an emergency management consultancy group. And we looked at festivals and emergency management. And so while each of these studies looked at very distinct aspects of festivals and festival experiences, you'll see after I introduce each of them how they came together to inform the research I'm doing now and want to share with you today. So the research that I undertook with Kyle Woosnam looked at festivals and community outcomes. And the purpose of that research was to examine the relationship between sense of community and festival attendance and provide a theory-driven insight into how festivals contribute to community development broadly. So this research was being done before I began to explore emergency management and disaster recovery. And so the findings from this research highlighted the fact that people who engage with festivals, who attend festival, they do so because they have certain needs that are fulfilled. They feel a sense of membership towards a community, that by attending the festival, they feel like they have an influence on the community, and that they develop an emotional connection to a community. And that emotional connection to a community was a really important part of the role that festival attendance played in respondents' overall sense of community. And so this was research we undertook both at a Canadian festival in rural Manitoba, in the province in which I live, as well as in rural Texas in the United States, which is where Kyle was located at the time. And so it was through these surveys of residents and visitors that we learned that sense of community is deeply tied to festival attendance. So those people that attend the festival develop a stronger sense of community. So I want to talk about two of the other studies I just mentioned, the study on festival cancellation that I worked on with Drizelda, as well as the study on crisis communication that I worked on with Sean Corrigan. And so I've listed here the purpose of each of those studies. So the first study was to examine how festival administrators communicate a festival cancellation on social media and how attendees who ultimately determine the success or failure of a festival react to a cancellation message. And so this was done doing a social media analysis of online social media posts. The second study also looked at social media posts, but explored the way information flows over social media during the course of an on-site festival emergency. And we looked at 3 festivals that experienced an emergency. One was a shooting, one was a stage collapse, and the other was a wildfire evacuation. And what we found, if we look at kind of the general findings of both these studies, it's that festival cancellation affects more than the festival itself. That when a festival is canceled by an organization, how the organization is perceived changes. And depending on how they communicate their message around the cancellation or the emergency, affects the trust that people have in the organization. So a fourth study I wanted to mention that helped inform the research I'm going to talk about shortly was the research that we did during the pandemic. Sasha Coleman and I undertook a study of Canadian-only festivals and looked at how they were adapting their business models over the course of the festival. And so we wanted to understand how the pandemic was affecting the organizations, and specifically how change making within the organization itself and factors affecting those changes were explored. What we found through this work was that crisis can spur adaptive and transformational change, and that this contributes to overall organizational change, sustainability, and innovation. And what we found is that there were 2 ways that festival organizations were innovating over the course of the pandemic. One was innovation adoption. So this is where they would adopt some sort of innovation that they saw other festivals doing. And then the other was innovation generation, where they developed new innovations to respond to the pandemic. And these opportunities to innovate were specifically triggered by the crisis they faced with the pandemic. Here's a couple of examples. The pandemic study involved interviews with Canadian festivals, and here's some great quotes from participants that highlight what the festivals were facing. And the first one talks about how I think we'll be able to go ahead in some form, and it could be completely different, but at the core, we will still be there. I think most of our content would work quite well online. And this is an example of that innovation adoption, a festival recognizing that they need to adopt online technology in order to launch their festival in the context of the pandemic. But we also saw many examples of innovation generation over the course of the pandemic. So one example that I quite liked was a parade in the United States where they decided to continue with their event, but they could not have a parade happen in the streets because they wouldn't be allowed to draw large crowds and it would be unsafe. And you have to remember that this was very early in the pandemic. And so what they did is they did a reverse parade where they had a porch parade, and they invited members of the community to decorate their porches. And then they printed a map of all the porches in the community that were decorated. And so that provides an example of innovation generation where they were trying to come up with a completely new way of doing what they had been doing. So the final past study I wanted to talk about that I mentioned earlier looked at something called service dominant logic and the festival experience. And this study provides a theoretical framework that I'm going to come back to at the very end of today's presentation. But the purpose of this study was to understand the process of value co-creation by examining festival attendees' perspectives of their festival experiences. So we use something called service dominant logic, adopted from economics and marketing research. And service dominant logic is used as a framework to understand how value is co-created in the festival setting. So at the time we did this research, there was a lot of writing in the academic literature about co-created experiences in festivals, but there was very little discussion of what is the theoretical mechanism that helps us understand how experiences are co-created. And so service dominant logic is a way of looking at how we create experiences by doing so together. So various groups coming together and bringing their resources, their knowledge, their skills, and their abilities together to co-create something new. And this research involved on-site interviews with festivals here in Winnipeg and Manitoba. And so we looked at 5 festivals and we did on-site interviews and used something called personal meaning maps to have attendees tell us what the meaning of their experience was. And through these personal meaning maps, we developed the model that you see on the screen in front of you, where we acknowledge that the festival experience is based on the festival putting forward value propositions, this being the art that's presented, the services that are offered, and the other experiences that are had at the festival. But the festival purely putting forward these pieces of value isn't enough to create a meaningful festival experience. That the attendees' own personal context, their mental, emotional, behavioral contexts influence how those value propositions are experienced. So, for example, if somebody comes to a festival, they're super happy to be there. They've had experience at that festival before. They have connections and meaningful relationships at the festival, and they want to get really engaged in what's going on. And imagine, if you will, it's a music festival and they're participating by dancing and so on. That's going to be a very different experience than another participant who's being dragged there by their spouse or partner, and they're not really interested in the music and they just kind of want to sit on their own. Those are 2 very different experiences. So you can see how the festival, in combination with the attendee, create a different experience, but also that there are many influential others. And these are the volunteers, the vendors, the performers that also deeply influence what is experienced, and that those experiences happen in a context, and that context matters. And that context includes the social, cultural, physical, and place-based contexts. And so concepts like sense of place and how people perceive a space really matter in a festival setting. And that it's through the integration of all of these components that we see value created through the festival experience. And so I just shared with you 5 different studies that were done in the past. And I did so because I wanted to highlight how all of this various research really culminated in the research that we're doing now. So the research that I'm focused on these days explores how do festivals contribute to community recovery after a disaster. And this idea about the value of festivals in emergency management and disaster management really came as kind of little sparks of curiosity from the past research that I just highlighted. So, from the research on festivals and sense of community, this idea that festivals fulfill a need and involve an emotional connection to a community got me thinking about what need can festivals fulfill in a community that has experienced or is at risk of disaster. The research around the the festival business model shifting over the course of pandemic and looking at how innovations are adopted or generated got me thinking about how are festivals able to contribute to disaster management through innovation adoption and innovation generation, and how does this process play into recovery? The research on crisis communication and festival cancellation really sparked an interest in how festivals are vulnerable. Festival cancellation is common, and festivals are vulnerable to miscommunication as well. We learned from some of that research. And so, if we know festivals are vulnerable, they're also vulnerable to disaster. And so, it's really important that festivals as organization prepare to respond in the case of a disaster within a community. And then finally, the research on festivals and service dominant logic really sparked an interest in how festivals are part of this broader service ecosystem, that festivals as organizations don't stand alone or apart from the rest of the community. And unlike other types of organizations, we see that festivals tend to have vast networks of all sorts of different groups within a community, whether it's performers, volunteers, vendors, businesses, tourism, residents. And so festivals are a part of a service ecosystem, and that this reflects a whole community approach to dealing with disasters. And so these distinct areas of research have culminated in an exploration of the role of festivals in disaster management, and specifically looking at how festivals contribute to community recovery. So now on to the work that's ongoing and that's happening as we speak, actually. So the purpose of the current research is to explore the role of festivals in response to emergencies and disasters and their contribution to community resilience building and recovery. So, in general, festivals are implemented for many, many reasons, including things like destination image enhancement, destination branding, community engagement and development, and to provide new experiences for residents and visitors. Oftentimes, festivals have very clear missions around promoting certain aspects of arts and culture and contributing to community. But what we see is that once a disaster is either becomes a concern within a community or has happened and is deeply affecting a community, festivals continue to be implemented within those communities. And that includes new events that are established to help with recovery, but it also includes festivals that have always taken place in a community that are relaunched in order to address issues around recovery. And we'll explore these different types of events as I move through the rest of the presentation. But as always, it's important that we start out on the same page. And so I want to talk about how I'm defining disaster and resilience, since these are key concepts in the current research. So, a disaster is an event that involves a hazard that has consequences in terms of damage, livelihoods, economic disruption, and/or casualties that are too great for the affected area and people to deal with on their own. It's interesting because just this week alone, I think it was 2 nights ago, I was making supper and I had turned the news on in the background. And the top 3 news stories were all disaster related. They were specifically disasters based on hazards within a community. So here in Canada, we are having a very early and very extreme wildfire season. And so the first news story was about the out-of-control wildfires in the province of Alberta. The second news story was about how those wildfires were creating health hazards across the country. And as you can hear, my voice is hoarse, and it's very likely the fire smoke that is in the air. And I'm 2 provinces away from where those fires are happening right now. And it's having a huge impact on our community. And I also heard that air quality in parts of Mexico is being impacted by volcanoes there. And so we hear more and more news reports about disasters impacting communities, not only the communities where the disaster is happening, but communities far and wide. And so as we see that globally, life-threatening disasters triggered by natural events are increasing, we also see that there's increasing conflict and aggression in the world that's leading to disasters like what's being experienced in Ukraine because of war. And so disaster preparedness and recovery are concepts that are relevant to every community. And so exploring the roles that festivals play in responding to disaster, I think, is becoming increasingly important, because the disaster management literature highlights how important it is that when a disaster has struck a community, that a whole community approach is taken. And that means that all aspects of a community, whether it's not-for-profit organizations, government, businesses, community members, need to come together in order to aid in recovery, and that is how recovery begins to happen. Resilience is a concept that comes to us from ecosystems management and looks at the ability or capacity to return to a state of balance after some sort of disruption. There's different literatures around resilience, and one concept that I think is really useful is this idea of adaptive capacities. And so when we're able to not just return to a state of balance in terms of recovering through being resilient, but also adapt in unique ways. So resilience with regards to disaster recovery is a process of linking these adaptive capacities and developing a positive way forward as a result of adapting to the disaster that has impacted a community. Recovery is the fourth pillar of emergency management, and recovery comes after disaster mitigation, preparation, and response. And so recovery includes the actions taken after a disaster to restore or to build back better, ideally. And so these are the concepts that I want to better understand and explore in terms of how festivals can contribute to these processes. So this body of research is guided by the following research questions. I'm going to highlight a number of research questions, but I'm going to break them up throughout the rest of the presentation because I want to be sure to share with you real-world case studies that help us better understand the concept of how festivals contribute to disaster management, but also recovery within a community. So the first research question is, how do festivals contribute or not to disaster management, and what festival and disaster characteristics influence this contribution? So begin to understand the role festivals may or may not play in the context of disaster management within a community. I've designed a sequential mixed methods study working with my collaborator, Jean Slick, at Royal Roads University. And the sequential mixed methods study is considered sequential because first we're undertaking a typology where we're looking at ideal cases. And so a typology in this instance is really useful because it helps us provide conceptual clarity. It allows us to analyze and compare like cases, and it helps us contribute to the development of theory and facilitate our own understanding of the role festivals play in disaster management. And so, because there's very little literature on this topic, we felt that starting with festival inventory and typology, where we look at the different festival and disaster characteristics that exist in the world, that would help us to better conceptualize the role festivals play. And then the second portion of this mixed method study, the second in the sequence, is the multiple case study design, where we are undertaking in total 8 case studies of festivals, and I'll share some of those with you today. But first, what I want to do is talk about the typology, because this work is closer to being completed, and then I'll talk briefly about the multiple case study portion of the research. So the very first step in understanding the role festivals may or may not play in disaster management was to undertake a festival inventory globally. And so we began with an online search of key terms where we looked at the term festival and then a number of additional terms. So festival and disaster, festival, and then specific types of disasters. And we looked at climate-related disasters, hydrometeorological disasters, human-induced disasters, technical disasters, and we tried to include both human and natural hazards that led to disaster. So we looked on 2 different search engines, so Google and Bing, and we looked at festivals and earthquake, festival volcano, festival hurricane, typhoon, flood, fire, as well as war, conflict, and we had tried to be as comprehensive as we could. Once we found 50 festival cases representing a wide range of festivals and communities that had experienced disaster, then we put a pause on our search because we felt that with 50 cases, we could begin to explore the potential opportunity to create typologies of how festivals respond to hazards. And so I'm going to share with you some of our preliminary work with those festivals. So once we identified a festival, we developed an Excel spreadsheet really that identified a number of characteristics, both about the festival as well as about the disaster. And so some of the information we collected was about the festival organization, and other information we collected was about the way in which the festival was engaged with a disaster. And so the Disaster Research Center offers a typology that describes the different ways that all sorts of organizations can be involved in disaster management. And their typology talks about 4 types of organizations, but I'm only going to talk about 2 of them because only 2 of them are relevant here. So there's type 3 organizations, which are organizations that already exist in a community, but respond to a disaster, and type 4 organizations, which are organizations that emerge because of a disaster. And so we put that along one dimension of our typology, and we looked at festival organizations that either existed before the disaster or emerged because of the disaster. And then the other dimension we looked at was the stage and emergency management that the festival was connected to. And we were able to place all of the cases that we looked at along these dimensions. And I'm just going to highlight 4 quick cases for you that fit within these 4 categories. So here's an example from Belize, where there was an existing festival I believe it started in the 1990s, the Palencia Lobster Festival. And this is a festival that celebrates lobster. But in the past year, what they've had is at the festival, they've had the National Emergency Management Organization have a booth to help people better prepare for hurricanes. And so this is an example of an existing festival organization that contributes to mitigation and preparedness. The next example I have in our typology is Two Rivers Remix, which is a festival that takes place here in British Columbia. And this is an existing festival, music and Indigenous music and arts festival. And they're an existing festival that responded to and contributed to recovery of a disaster. So there are both wildfires and flooding within the communities where this festival was held. And so they revamped the festival to be able to take place in multiple smaller communities after these disasters happened. Then we have emergent festival organizations that respond to mitigation and preparedness. And an example of this is Ember Stomp in Marin County, California, where an organization called Fire Safe Marin decided to launch a festival to help people prepare for wildfires. And they felt that this was important because the festival offered a different way of reaching a different audience than they typically were able to reach with their other educational material. And then the fourth type is those festival organizations that emerge to respond and recover from disaster. And so the example here is East Gippsland Winter Festival in Australia, where they had experienced wildfires and traditionally high tourist area saw low visitation, both because of wildfires and COVID. And so the founder of this festival thought a winter festival could be a useful way to bring visitors back to an area that they had left because of the multiple impacts of the wildfires and COVID-19 pandemic. As we look at these typologies, we also saw that there was an element of time that differentiated the different types of festivals. And so there were long-standing festivals, ongoing festivals, and retired festivals. So an example of a long-standing festival was Iphistia Festival in Santorini, Greece, which was named after the Greek word for volcano. And so this is a festival that takes place that involves fireworks, but it recognizes the historic volcano eruption from around 1600 BC or BCE. And so this is why we refer to it as a long-standing festival. The festival has been going on for a long time, but there's a very large gap between when the disaster happened and the festival. Ongoing, the example I give is the tornado days in Miltona, Minnesota, where the disaster happened within living memory. So I believe it was about 50 years ago. So there are still people alive who have experienced that disaster, unlike the example I just gave of the volcano festival. And so Tornado Days continues to exist as a festival and looks at how people respond to the tornado. And then an example of a retired festival is Festa, which is a festival produced to help a community reimagine what the city of Christchurch could look like after the Christchurch earthquakes. And so this festival emerged after the devastating earthquakes as a way to help a community kind of imagine a different future for the city. And that festival stopped, I believe, in 2018. And a conversation I had with somebody involved with the festival suggested that it stopped because it had kind of served its purpose. And so you could see how the gap between when the disaster happens and the festival, as well as the length of time the festival runs, influences the types of festivals that occur to help respond to a disaster. I notice we're at about 43 minutes in the presentation, and so I'm going to start wrapping up. I want to share with you a couple more research questions that I'm actively working on, and a few insights, but we should be done in the next 3 to 5 minutes for anybody who's watching the clock. So the research questions for the case study research, so that was the typology research that we have underway. But I mentioned this is a mixed method study that also involves in-depth case studies, where we're undertaking case studies with 8 festivals. And what we're doing is interviewing 5 to 10 different stakeholders involved in each festival. And with 4 of the festivals, we'll actually be interviewing festival attendees. And this research seeks to understand how various actors, festival staff, volunteers, attendees, municipal employees, tourism management organizers, and so on, see their role and the role of the other festival stakeholders in disaster recovery, as well as explore how social capital and value co-creation relate to resilience, and looking at how the service ecosystem holds together to function in disaster management context to contribute or detract from disaster recovery. So from that inventory of about 50 cases that I mentioned, we've reached out to many festivals, and we actually have 4 festivals on board now that we used our typologies to help us select. And so we have festivals from each dimension of the typology that we're interviewing. And at this stage, we haven't done a full analysis of all the festival case studies that we've already completed. Well, we're midway through 4 of them, and then we're going to be recruiting the next 4 in the coming year. But there is one key insight that I did want to share today, and that is that when we look at the service ecosystem that I introduced earlier when I talked about service dominant logic, the service ecosystem is this idea that various actors bring resources to help create value. And based on the research we've been doing, this model holds true in a disaster recovery context or a disaster preparedness context. And so the initial findings are that network coordination in disaster management is enhanced by multiplex ties, including both vertical and horizontal connections with other organizations. So one of the key things that we're finding in the interviews that we're doing with festival organizers is that it's both those personal connections to other members in the community, as well as those hierarchical connections where different organizations have a responsibility to each other that come together that allow festivals organizations to make a meaningful contribution to disaster management. And so we've even seen it with festivals that exist to help a community prepare for a disaster. It's these multiple ties and interactions among organizations that already exist that allow them to play a meaningful role in contributing to disaster management. And the same is true for communities that are recovering from a disaster, that the festival organizations that tend to have a lot of network connections, both with like organizations, so other festival organizers, performing groups, or very different organizations. So festival organizations that have connections with, say, tourism or with emergency management, that the more network ties they have, the better positioned they are to contribute to disaster management and any stage of disaster management, whether it's mitigation, preparedness, response or recovery. That's a very preliminary finding, but so far after looking at 3 of the festivals, it seems to be that is a common link between all of them. And that brings us to the end of my presentation today. Here's a quote from Kierkegaard that I quite like. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And in the face of increasing disasters and increasing severity of natural storms and processes, I think it's really important that we take time to reflect on how we respond and how we develop organizations that are better able to help a community meet the challenges that are faced when disaster impacts the community. thank you for being with us here today. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm also happy to share references if anything I chatted about interested you or inspired you in any way.
Thank you so much, Christine. It is a really interesting topic. It's and we have a few questions. Like the first question is how the liminality concept is linked to festival risk management, or how do you link it?
It's interesting. I haven't formally linked it. To me, liminality helps us understand the roles that festivals play in our individual lives. But I can tell you just from I'm deep into these interviews, and so every couple days I'm doing an interview with a festival organizer. And I've already noticed that when they talk about what it means to come together after a disaster, they talk about the kind of drudgery of dealing with recovering from a disaster that a lot of people face. So the day-to-day life after having experienced a wildfire or a flood can be quite challenging and emotional and heavy. And the festival organizers we've interviewed talk about how when people come out to the festival after a disaster has happened, there's this sense of almost like relief, like they're able to share with the burden with their community, that they, in this very kind of playful way. And one of the festivals we talked to actually talks about having a large bonfire at the festival. And this is a community that experienced wildfire. So I had to ask, like, what does that feel like to be standing next to a fire? And they talk about how experiencing fire in a different context like that brings new meaning and makes it less scary. And I can't help but think about that idea of liminality, and that apart from everyday life and that transitional space and time being really meaningful. So I haven't formally thought about it, but I definitely think there's a link there to be made.
Thanks. We also are working like with this concept in our research about the Day of the Dead here in Mexico, and we think it's really interesting because here's the belief that that people come to life, right? And the liminality is really is ad hoc like to that kind of festival, no? And I was thinking also about the Ifestia festival that you mentioned, the Santorini, Greece, and it's very similar to the festival that I was talking to you about, the one we call it the Mexican Pompeii. It's in Michoacan, but here it has Catholic connotation because it says that Jesus Christ save or illuminate the people to go away from the volcano, and then a new place could be emerged. No, and it's kind of interesting because a festival every year it's held because of this. No, it's really interesting. We have another couple of questions. I'm going to read it because I think it's like the same theme. Is one of them is what is the role of tourists in this concept of community sense for festivals? Do you think festival experience should be adapted to tourists and locals, inhabitants? Like there will be a difference? And we have another question, but it's another theme. So if you want to respond to this first.
I find the role of tourists in festivals a very interesting and challenging one, because as I mentioned earlier, often we use the idea of festivals as a selling feature for a community. We use it to promote it, but very rarely is that why a festival exists. Sometimes they do, right, as a destination branding, but more often than not, they're a deeply ingrained part of a community that the community is offering tourists the opportunity to visit. And when we actually look at how many tourists attend, it's actually a very small proportion typically of the overall festival or event that is tourists. And so based on that, I think that to ensure authenticity of a festival experience, that a community needs to be true to its own culture, history, geography in order to create a meaningful visitor experience. And as I said, when you look at that service dominant logic, value is created by all of these groups coming together. So by a festival organization or a community group trying to produce something that's attractive to visitors, I think that a meaningful part of that will be lost. And so I do think it's a huge challenge. And I think as festivals grow in size and scale, the challenge becomes even more difficult because there's more pressure on the festival organizers to, keep increasing attendees and, reinventing themselves. And you'll often hear, if you, as Drizelda and I have done, if you look at social media posting around festivals online, you get really interesting insight into how people are feeling and thinking about a festival. And, people really start to complain when a festival starts to feel generic. And so that's a real risk, I think, that festivals face.
And the last question is, since you have worked with different festivals in different places, have you find differences in risk management or disaster management?
Yeah, I didn't talk about this project at all during today's presentation. Just as you saw, we got pretty tight on time. We actually did a study where we looked at emergency management plans from festivals from 3 different communities. And what I can say, so it was Canada, the United States, and Australia. And I can tell you that most festivals that we worked with were severely underprepared. Most festivals do not have formal, comprehensive emergency plans. At most, they tended to have very specific emergency responses. So they might have a chain of command, and they might have a plan for the most common types of emergencies. So a missing child or a medical emergency like heart attack. But almost none of the festivals we collected data from, and I think in the end it was 25, I think one maybe had a full comprehensive emergency management plan that looked at the range of emergency and disasters. Most did not. And when we interviewed people about that, ultimately, it came down to time and money. Festival organizations are often working on very tight timelines, very low budgets, and very few staff. And so they just don't have the capacity. And part of some of the work I've done speaking is to advocate that our emergency management organizations that are publicly funded need to do more to support these not-for-profit community events because they don't have the internal capacity. But when a disaster happens, it affects everybody in a community.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. It is a pleasure to hear you and to know more about your research. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me today.